Hello, everybody. My name is Joshua Young, and today I'm going to be discussing with you some topics that I've been carrying on my shoulders and on my heart for the last 3 years in regards to the entire UAP disclosure movement and religion, surprisingly. About 3 years ago, I had a series of supernatural experiences that completely shook me to the core and left me both excited about living and at the same time kind of scared about what's going on. So I'm going to be addressing these topics in this video and in others, and I'm hoping you can come along for the ride and join me on this incredible adventure that we call life. Many of you have probably already seen the 3 famous videos that the U.S. Navy has announced in conjunction with the Department of Defense in the United States are real recordings of objects traveling through our atmosphere. What appear to be physical objects that reflect radar. They are seen by multiple pilots. Those pilots have gone on shows like Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman, and others to discuss what happens and what they saw. Many people have tried to debunk these sightings. However, with the admission by the U.S. government that these are real recordings, it brings up a lot of questions. Well, unbeknownst to myself at the time, I didn't know these videos were going to be released. I didn't know they existed. I was experiencing back in, I guess it would have been 2019, right? It would have been around between April of 2019 and around this time in 2019. So around beginning of October-ish. I was experiencing my own UAP experiences. And what I was experiencing was not just that. One of the most complex issues with the entire UFO and UAP topic is that most people who experience UFOs of some sort also experience incredible synchronicities in their life. They will have revelations, they will have dreams, they may have visions, they may have thoughts put in their head, they may experience out-of-body experiences or poltergeist activity in their home, all sorts of things like that. If you haven't checked it out, you should definitely look up the events that are happening on Skinwalker Ranch right now. Skinwalker Ranch is a hotbed for this type of activity, including UFOs, and they are recording many of these instances of just strange anomalies that are clearly showing some form of interaction from what appears to be some other intelligent life in our universe. So, what does this all mean? How are we supposed to approach this topic? We don't have normal scientific tools for this, right? We can't capture these phenomena. Many attempts have been made to try to capture them, at least by the public. Perhaps the government has captured some of this and knows more than they're telling. However, it's really difficult to study. If you go throughout history and you go back to the Bible, which I have studied extensively, I did go to Bible school, I grew up fundamentalist Christian, and the topic is so fascinating because when you read the stories of people who've had supernatural or paranormal experiences, there is this incredible intersection of emotions and thoughts and an explosion of new ideas in many cases, and wonder and awe all thrown together into one. In other words, it appears that there are beings in the universe that are trying to communicate to us about topics that they want us to know or to think. It gets quite tricky though, because this isn't a straightforward revelation generally. We don't normally get revelations about things like science. No being showed up and showed people how to create an engine, for example. To our knowledge, maybe passively in the background it happened. Or no being showed up and handed us an electronic circuit and said, here we go, and here's the instruction manual for it, right? It seems like throughout history, there have been moments of revelation, you might say, whether it could be the Egyptians or the ancient Hebrews or Jesus or all the Catholic saints. And when these revelations come in, they are almost imbued with a deeper background intention that is symbolic in nature. And the symbolism behind ends up being amalgamated into a fixed sort of set of doctrines that we would call religion, right? At least this is what I've observed. It seems very strange how this occurs, but it does seem to be happening. So before I get into what happened with me, I want to just address this topic and say that if you do your research on this, it's not clear cut. We are not talking about nuts and bolts craft necessarily. We're talking about something that has to do with consciousness as well. It goes much deeper. There's a famous person in the UFO community named Jacques Vallée. And Jacques Vallée noticed this a long time ago, and he's been writing books about it. I highly recommend you check out Jacques Vallée's older books because he addresses this from the standpoint of simply an observer, observing the activities of, for example, a new species that perhaps we have discovered and we just don't know anything about. The difference with a new species and what's happening here is that this seems to be interacting with us, almost like we are the ones being observed. It brings to mind things like in the Old Testament where there's passages that talk about the watchers and the idea that angels and stars are connected, these sorts of things, right? A lot of stuff to unpack here. I'm going to jump into my story here in a little bit. So, all right, stay tuned. Okay, let's get started with my story. And I'll let you be forewarned. This story is oftentimes difficult for me to tell and to go into detail on. I will try to summarize the story as much as I can, and maybe in later videos I can get a little deeper into the specifics of what happened in various instances. In 2017, I believe, I was living in Stockholm, Sweden. I had been living there for not very long, and part of the reason I had moved to Sweden was because I was a devout, I guess you could say, it's probably a bad word to use, but a very adamant atheist, that's probably a better word, and a skeptic about anything. I had done my own research on various topics when I was at Bible school back in Chicago, and I had basically reached the conclusion that none of it made any sense. The stories in the Bible, when taken by themselves, perhaps could create a Christian vision that was cohesive by itself, but then when you tried to put everything together, the historical narrative, our understanding of human psychology, and a lot of other factors, including like evolution, for example, when you try to smash them together, it's paradigm breaking. So that's why I became an atheist. And before I became an atheist, though, I had some spiritual experiences. When I was a teenager, I would recurringly have this experience where I would be laying in bed, I would be awake, and I would feel a presence come in the room. A dark presence, a malevolent presence, it felt like, something that wanted to really scare me, and all my hair would stand up, and in many cases, I would try to roll over, maybe like squint my eyes because I was afraid something would show itself. I was in control of my body. I wasn't like sleep paralysis, like some people have said, where they're like frozen and they, something enters the room and like a shadow. I didn't see a shadow or anything like that. I didn't see anything, and I didn't hear anything. So no visual or auditory hallucinations. I was simply feeling like something was watching me and that it had evil intentions toward me. Around the age of, I think it must have been around the age of 15, I was going through a really dark period. I was feeling incredibly depressed all the time. There was a lot of inner angst, and I had a dream. In that dream, I was in complete darkness, very similar to the Stranger Things show, if you've seen that, when Elle goes into the dark area, into the void between the worlds, right? And she can see things that are happening kind of on both sides of the upside down in the real world, right? Similar to that, completely black. I didn't see anything, and I was terrified because I was alone. Out of the darkness, this dog lunges at my face. Completely, I was frozen in the dream at this point, completely terrified, this dog lunging at me. The thing was enraged and wanted to eat me. And as it was lunging toward my face, I didn't know what to do. Must have been a split second, like 2 or 3 seconds worth of this dog lunging at me. And right when it gets to my nose, right when it gets about here, I hear a clink. And in shock, I look down and I see a chain that was attached to this dog's neck. And then I woke up and I felt this little voice say, "Josh, this is what the devil's like. He can only go so far, but he'll always be on a chain." And that was it. And this dark period of my life continued for quite some time until finally I decided to just kind of ignore it, to be honest. I was having lots of depression, lots of anxiety, especially about things in relation to Christianity. a lot of doubts about heaven, hell, my position, whether I was a real Christian or not, that type of stuff. If you talk to people who have grown up in more fundamentalist Christian communities, these are pretty typical fears that people have in those communities that are not often talked about outside of the communities anyway. In any case, I would go to Bible school. And I was fascinated by the idea of atheists. They didn't make any sense to me. I couldn't understand, especially because I had had some spiritual experiences, I couldn't understand how anybody wouldn't believe in God. And I kind of made it a goal of mine to study atheists in particular and to truly understand what they were thinking. I didn't want to just approach them like a typical Christian apologist and smash whatever information I could down their throats in the hopes that it would just be digested by them and they would convert. And in the process, I became an atheist myself. And around the time that I became an atheist, I prayed a prayer. And this prayer was very specific. I said, God, angels, or aliens. I had been doing a lot of research on just paranormal events in the world to look for any evidence of anything supernatural or paranormal, and was very frustrated with my findings. So in my mind at that time, it was like I thought it was all bunk. There's no possibility anything could exist out there besides life that had evolved on this planet. I wanted evidence, though. So I prayed and I said, hey, God, angels, or aliens, if there's anything out there that exists and is paying attention to me and really cares and wants to make itself known, I'll give you the opportunity to make yourself known. However, I had some stipulations. The stipulations were that I wanted an event, a paranormal or supernatural event, to happen more than once. And I needed a witness who was there, so I know it wasn't just in my own head, as a lot of people who have spiritual experiences get accused of all the time. It's just in your head. So I prayed specifically that there'd be a witness, at least one witness present. And I said that I shouldn't be able to come up with a natural explanation for it. A lot of times people claim that something supernatural happened, and then you can invent a natural explanation for what happened. And the fact that you can invent a natural explanation for what happened ends up becoming a reason for people to be skeptical about it, including myself, right? So these are my three primary stipulations. I may have given more at the time, but these are the main ones I remember. I would have been roughly 21, 22 years old at this time. And I became an atheist. Fast forward 10 years, I moved to Sweden. I was absolutely tired of the political situation in the US. I was tired of religion. I had been debating with family and with old Christian friends, things related to Christianity, and was just tired of it. It just seemed like a complete waste of time. Some people have already decided what they believe, and they just don't care what sort of data that might exist out there. Moved to Sweden, like, hey, this is great. I'm in like what is supposed to be at that time like one of the happiest countries in the world and full of atheists, and I was excited to explore that. Well, this would have been around Halloween, so oh wow, that's crazy. This is almost exactly 4 years ago now, I believe. I had an opportunity to go to London, and I got an Airbnb the one night. The friend I was supposed to stay with canceled at the last minute because he had to go out of town. So I get this Airbnb this one night, and I arrive. This would have been on, I think it would have been a Friday night. And the woman greets me at the door. It's a very old building. And she says, hello, Josh. I have multiple tenants staying here, and I would like to, invite you into this room that I have, but I have other tenants staying in other rooms. Please don't interrupt them. Oh, and by the way, there's another guy sitting here. I'll use a pseudonym named Rick. And Rick is working on some video production for the United Nations right now, and he's very busy. Please don't interrupt him. I said hi to Rick. Go to bed. Next morning, get up. There's only one bathroom in this entire building, by the way. And I'm in the bathroom taking a shower, right? Incredibly vulnerable spot, I guess you could say. And the woman who owns the place comes by, and she goes, excuse me, sir, outside the door. And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of awkward. I can't really like just instantly jump out of the shower. So I yell back and I say, yeah, what do you need? And there's no response. So I yell it again. I'm like, hello, what do you need? And still no response. And I thought, okay, well, maybe she found what she needed and she just walked off. And And I go about my day on Saturday. Saturday night, I ended up going to a Halloween party with a friend in London and ended up staying at her place that night. Sunday rolls around, and I was hoping I could stay another night at her place, but she lets me know that she's starting her new business the day after and she needed to focus. So she was kind of hoping, since she wasn't planning on me coming, that I could go back to this Airbnb. So I said, sure, that's fine. So I rebooked the Airbnb for that night. And I arrive again. And it's very important that I book this on 2 separate days, because nobody on the entire planet, including myself, knew that I was going to book for 2 days at this Airbnb. The next morning, I am going to be interviewing for my dream job at Spotify. I'm in the shower, and again, you can guess what happened. Yeah, comes by the door, excuse me, sir. And I'm like, what in the world? Like twice in a row? Like, what is, so I yell again. Yeah, what do you need? Nothing, no response. I'm like, oh, well, maybe the shower water is too loud. I'm going to turn it off, and then I'm going to yell hello. That way, if she had like started to walk down the hall or she couldn't quite hear me, she would be able to hear me. So the bathroom's completely silent. I yell hello, no response. And I was a little bit miffed, I guess you could say. Like, it's kind of rude to interrupt with somebody in the shower, especially twice on 2 separate days. I go to open the door, open it up, step outside, and who is sitting there? Rick was sitting there. Rick was sitting at his laptop. He had been working on the video, and he looks up and goes, Josh, who were you talking to? And I'm dumbfounded. I'm like, well, clearly somebody came by the door. It must have been the owner of the house wanted in or wanted something from me while I was in the bathroom. And he goes, Josh, we're the only 2 people in the house right now, and nobody came by. I've been sitting here the entire time. And I was perplexed. So I asked him, I'm like, well, are you sure? Did you ever leave or anything? He says, no, Josh, I've been sitting here the entire time. And then he goes, Josh, are you religious? And I took a step back and I was like, oh, this is ridiculous. Like, this guy is starting to think this is some sort of a paranormal encounter of some sort. And I thought to myself, well, I've been an atheist now for roughly 10 years. I can probably debunk this. Shouldn't be too hard. So I spent 45 minutes trying to debunk this, and I tried everything. I have written some things on some of the things I've tried on this to like try and debunk this, looking for speakers, any sort of wind like pipe of some sort that could have occurred. I turned back on the shower water and ran it, and there was nothing. Never heard a sound like that again. And he told me that he had been visiting this Airbnb for quite some time and had never heard anything like that. So I asked him what he heard, and he said he heard what sounded like a whooshing sound, or an utterance was the word he used. Almost like it was a voice, but he said he didn't hear any words. And I asked him where he heard it, and he said he was head height in front of the bathroom and on the outside of the door, so on his side. When he heard it, he looked up and didn't see anything, so he thought nothing of it until I replied to it. And he said when I replied to it, that's when he knew something was up. And he then goes into his religious background. He's an Episcopalian Christian, something he called Catholic Light, and he's telling me that he believes all this stuff. And we're sitting there discussing this, and sure enough, the owner of the house comes back with groceries in her hands. She had been gone this entire time, and then she sees me talking to the guy that she told me not to interrupt and goes, hey, what's going on? And I tell her I heard a voice outside of the bathroom door, and I thought it was her. And she goes, oh, Josh, stuff like that happens all the time. This place is haunted. And I froze. You could say I blue screened, I suppose. It was like I just like, bloop. I had no idea even how to describe what I was feeling at that moment. Because until that point, I had never experienced anything remotely supernatural that involved something that was outside of my own head, I guess you could say. And so I go to the Spotify interview. I get the job at Spotify, made some great friends there and everything like that. But this experience was the catalyst, I guess you could say, to me beginning to open my inner mind's eye to the idea that there could be something else going on. For the most part, though, I just shut down. I decided I was going to put this in the unknown bin and I would forget about it. So before I get into the next part of the story, I want to discuss this just a little bit more. One of the most perplexing things about this is that this story mirrors to some extent something like, say, the story of Samuel in the Bible. In the Bible, there's a story where Samuel, as a young boy, hears in the temple what he thinks is Eli, I believe that Eli was the high priest at the time, calling to him. And he goes, and it wasn't Eli, it was somebody else. Eli, after this happens a couple times, tells him that must be a messenger from the Lord. So Eli goes and gets a message from the Lord from this voice, this being, angel, I guess you could call it, was there in the temple. And my story mirrors that very closely. One thing she did say at the Airbnb was that many people had seen a woman in that house, but nobody had ever had the woman speak to them. So she knew the place had a lot of activity like this she had been there for like 20 years or so. But this was the first time anybody had ever had this voice speak to them. All right, that's about it for that portion of the story. We can get into the rest of it here in a little bit. I need to take a short break. I'll be back. So for the following 8 months, I was at Spotify. I had the fantastic job. I was in the most atheist country in the world, and I just sort of pushed the story out of my mind. I had forgot about it. And we went on a trip with some friends to Ibiza, and I met this girl who was a biologist, and she claimed that she didn't believe in anything supernatural at all. And I thought, you know what? I remembered the story, and I thought, I'm gonna bring it up with her. I'm going to see if she can find an explanation for this story. On the plus side, if she could, I would finally have an explanation for it. If she couldn't find an explanation for this story, I knew that maybe I found something or experienced something that was actually genuinely paranormal or supernatural. So I tell her the story. I even drew out the layout of the apartment or the Airbnb that I had stayed in, so she could get a feel for where the walls were and everything and where the doors were, so that way we could try to work together to come up with an explanation for this. And she couldn't do it. And I remember her getting really quiet and just kind of looking off into the distance. And I thought to myself, wow, like there's more going on here. And this is quite extraordinary. And maybe I actually have something. So I started to tease this a little bit with a few friends, like just telling the story a little bit about what had happened, and but in depth a little more. And at the same time, my life started to kind of spiral downhill. Downhill in the sense that everything on the exterior was really good, but internally, I was just finding conflict where conflict shouldn't be with a couple coworkers. I was dealing with monetary problems that were kind of popping up out of nowhere to some extent, some paperwork issues. My dating life was not going well at all. And I was thinking, this is just a mess. Like my life, I had made all the decisions to get where I was. I made the decision to go to Sweden. I made the decisions that I had to get me to where I was financially. I had shut down a business in the US. I made the decisions I did at the job I was at with these relationships I had. And one day it all kind of came to a head, and there were a couple intersecting really bad things that happened. And I was so angry. And due to a paperwork mix-up, I was waiting until roughly 4 a.m. in Sweden, which would have been evening New York time, to find out whether I was going to lose a whole bunch of money. And I was laying there in bed just fuming and not sure who I was angry at or why I was even in this position in life. My friends were making tons of money. Some of them were millionaires, and I'm sitting here struggling, and I had nobody to blame except myself. And I started to reflect on my life, and I started to reflect on how I had treated other people, and how in all these situations that were not good in my life, I had made the decision to get there. I had made all of these decisions, and I couldn't blame anybody else but myself. And in all the situations where other people were treating me in what I thought were selfish ways, I also could turn around and see how I was treating other people in those same selfish ways. And this made me realize just how selfish I was being. And then I remembered the story, and I remembered maybe there's something watching and listening. I don't know what it is. At this point in time, I had completely rejected anything related to Christianity. And so my old religious views were thrown out. Now what? So I said a little prayer. And the prayer basically went along the lines something like, God, angels, or aliens, reversing the prayer I'd had before. I don't know what you are. I don't know what's going on, but I'm tired of living my life for myself. And that exact moment, for the first time in, it must have been 10 or 11 years, that dark presence that I'd had in my teens came back and filled the room. Complete anger and hatred like I had never felt before in my life. And I was stunned, fearful. I wouldn't say I was frozen. I could move, but I was in shock that at the moment I decided that I didn't want to live for myself, this popped up. So instantly I'm thinking, okay, is this like something that Christians would call a demon, or is this like something that like Satan or something like that? I didn't know. And I was struggling to know how to even respond to it. It kind of eventually dissipated a bit, but this dark presence began to kind of harass me. And I would be at home and I could feel it when I'm walking around. It wasn't just when I was sleeping now. It was like more like kind of a constant that was there. I would sometimes feel it as I was walking toward my apartment, and I didn't know what to do at all. Well, I knew that something strange was going on, but I didn't know where to go in my thinking other than either I'm losing my mind and I'm experiencing some form of schizophrenia or some medical episode of some sort, right? And I decided there was only one thing I knew to do, and that was that I was going to have to go back and talk to Rick, who was at that apartment. We were friends on LinkedIn, and I thought, well, okay, I need to go back to him. It had been a year since that event occurred, and find out if his memory of what happened matched my memory. If it didn't, I would know that I was losing my mind, or that something else was going on. But the other option was that potentially he had played a prank on me, or somebody had played a prank on me, and I thought maybe he could clear that up. And if our memories did match, I knew that there was something real going on. Something real and supernatural was occurring. Scheduled the meeting with him. We played phone tag for a bit. Week before I'm supposed to meet with Rick, I sit down with a friend of mine that I grew up with actually back in the United States, who was also living in Stockholm at the time. And we go to a park in Stockholm, nicknamed Rollis. It's a famous park with a little skate park in it, and like people play disc golf there and all sorts of stuff. We're laying in the grass, and I'm telling him this story about this ghost experience that I had speaking to me in this apartment. And the air was, I remember feeling thick and charged. It felt like the fact that I was opening up about it happening was somehow, something was resisting that. It felt like I was doing something daring to even open up and talk about the fact that I was interested in supernatural things. He looks at me, suggests that Rick probably played a prank, and then I lay back in the grass and just kind of shrug, and I look up in the sky, and I see, and I kid you not, this is where it gets even weirder, I see two tiny little disc-shaped objects flying high in the atmosphere. And I point up and I say, hey, look at those in the sky. And he looks up and he sees them, and he looks back at me like I was crazy. I'm like, you're seeing them too, right? He goes, yeah. I go, well, what is it? He goes, I don't know. They were moving faster than the airliners in the sky were moving, if that gives an idea. And yet they were so far away and moving in formation in a beeline straight line, super high speed across the sky, that I couldn't imagine them being anything like a balloon or anything like that. And as this story progresses, you will understand that this couldn't have been a balloon. This was something else. In any case, I meet with Rick a week later, have a phone call with him, and I took notes during this call. I was going to try and record it, but I couldn't figure out a good way to record it at the time on my laptop while I was going to call him on my phone. It was just a mixed up situation. So instead I took like physical notes as he was talking. I still have those. And I call him up and I say, hey, Rick, can you please just tell me what happened in the apartment a year ago when I was there? He then reiterates to me almost identically what I remembered. So my memory was good. And he tells me that he's thought about it for the last year, and it has been really kind of disturbing him a little bit because he feels like what happened was a genuine supernatural experience. And he tells me that the experience that I had was something that he feels was a message directly for me, and that he was supposed to be the witness. Those were his words. I didn't tell him about my prayer that I had made before. And I'm frozen listening to this because I realize my entire view of reality is about to completely shift. He then recommends a book. Only one thing he recommended. He said, you need to read this one book. It's by a saint in the Catholic Church. He reminds me he's not Catholic, but he thinks this is a legitimate story. He tells me, don't read anything about this saint, just read this one book. The book ended up being a book about Padre Pio. And I remember opening it up and feeling like, oh, you've got to be kidding me. I did the classic thing where you like Google the person first before you like read about them to figure out what other people think. And, of course, I discovered that a lot of skeptics are like, this guy was a charlatan. He was faking it. He didn't actually perform any miracles. It was just delusion, mass delusion, all this other stuff, right? I'm like, oh man, I don't have anything to go off of right now though. So I should probably read this book. It's the only piece of the puzzle left. So I'm reading the book. I get all the way to like the third to last chapter of this book, and I come across this quote. As you can imagine, I nearly fell out of my chair or bed at the time that I was sitting on, and I started just crying. I was like, that really dark period of my life was long. It was super hard. I was incredibly depressed and anxious. And then with this one reading of this book, through a series of supernatural experiences, I get a link back to the dream that I had had when I was 15. And now my mind is just like, oh, this is getting even more confusing. Why Catholicism? Does this mean I'm supposed to become a Catholic now? Why that? Like, I don't believe the majority of the things in the Catholic Church. So what am I supposed to do with this? The other thing that started occurring around this time, it started one night when I went out on my balcony. I go out on the balcony, smoking a cigarette, and I look up in the sky and I see a light in the sky. It was like a spotlight. Like if you imagine somebody were taking a fixed giant spotlight that was probably about 10, 20 times bigger than Venus on a clear night. It was a clear sky, no clouds. I see this spotlight in the sky and I look up and I'm looking at it. And as soon as I looked at it, it kind of just faded and disappeared. And I'm thinking, well, that's just kind of strange. Like, I'm running through my head possibilities. I'm like, maybe it was a glint off of an airplane or a satellite or something like that. And I'm looking and I see nothing. Okay, so blue sky, giant bright light that just disappears. I stood there and waited to see, is there an airplane or something like going on? And nothing. Well, what was really interesting is that during this time, there would be periods where I was in an incredibly mentally dark place because of what was going on in the apartment. And the darkest points, I would go out on the balcony and I would see this again. And this happened probably half a dozen times over a period of several months that summer. Until I kind of hit a point where I'd started dating this girl and it didn't work out. And we met up, we were still friends. We met up for beers and she's telling me a little bit more about her life. And she's telling me that she feels like she has this dark void in her chest. And she feels like she's doing things that she doesn't think are good for her, but she's doing them anyway. And she's taking these medications and other stuff like that. And it was almost like she was kind of telling me this because she wanted not that she wanted advice, but maybe she just wanted someone to talk to about it, And I'm sitting there thinking, this is really odd because with the dark presence in my apartment, my first thought is maybe this is something demonic. That's what's going through my head, right? And I'd read the Padre Pio book and I'm starting to think along those lines, right? I don't remember if I told her that, but I go home that night and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, God, angels, whatever you are, I don't know how to pray for this girl, but I know that you're there and you're watching. What do I pray for? And this word gets like almost yelled into my head, and that word is the word deliverance. And that was it, just the word deliverance. And I remember asking, like, deliverance from what? Like, from what are you supposed to be delivered, right? I remember thinking, well, what exactly do I pray for? Simply asking for deliverance, how could that do any good? And not only that, but if you already know she needs to be delivered, why do I have to ask for it? That sort of stuff was going through my head. In any case, so I was starting to doubt everything that was occurring. And I started to think, man, this is just so crazy. Like, none of this stuff is lining up. I don't know that this thing in the sky that I keep seeing repeatedly isn't just me getting lucky with seeing a glint off of airplanes over and over. Maybe it's just coincidence that now, somewhere between 4 and 6 times that I had seen this thing, it just disappeared right when I looked at it. And I remember thinking in my head, not actually praying this per se. I just remember thinking, man, I'm not going to believe this thing is real unless it moves in a way that is extraordinary. I had been looking up UFOs. I'd been looking up stories. I couldn't find any stories that were like this. People had plenty of UFO stories of them spotting something once, or maybe they spotted something twice, but it didn't seem to be paying attention to them. Do you see what I'm saying? But in this case, this seemed to be like paying direct attention to me. And so I had just thought that thought. A couple days later, I go out on my balcony. And again, I see it. But this time it was different. This time it appears in the sky, super bright, and disappears. And I'm like, oh, well, I've seen that before. This isn't anything new. I look back and it appeared again. It'd never done this before. It never appeared twice. And then it disappeared. And I was like, oh man, this is interesting. And I look again and it appeared a third time. And then it accelerated from a standstill all the way down past the horizon till it disappeared. And I stood there in shock because clearly whatever this was, it knew what I was thinking that day or two before when I was saying that I wouldn't believe it was something extraordinary unless it did something extraordinary. But here it did something I had never seen anything on this planet ever do. It obviously wasn't a satellite. It obviously wasn't a meteor. Meteors don't accelerate. But what am I supposed to do with this? There's no information being communicated by this thing darting across the sky, right? And I'm perplexed. And so I'm like, okay, well, I do believe that I'm being paid attention to by something. Is this a classic, nuts and bolts UFO that's for some reason paying attention to me? Is this like an orb? Is this some supernatural interdimensional thing? Is this a classical angel? I don't know what this is. I was getting fed up with all of this. I had searched all over everything I could find on UFOs and found nothing even closely related to the story that I was experiencing. And there was no information contained in this UFO encounter that I could work with other than, hey, you're not alone, we're paying attention, and I felt like I was being protected. I might add one other thing here. Oh, so one thing I need to add in here. Back when I was in the apartment with talking to Rick about my experience, and he recommended the book, I did have what I felt was like the dark presence come back even stronger than ever right after talking to Rick about this whole situation with the ghost in the apartment, or the being. And right afterwards, this dark presence comes back. But for the first time, I felt 2 light presence, like 2 light beings appear, and they blocked out in front of me this dark presence, and then went, and I didn't see them visibly with my eyes. It was like I was seeing auras of them in front of me, and I was terrified. And they moved to either end of the apartment and just stood there. And I remember feeling like they were telling me that I needed this protection. I had connected this star thing in the sky with angels because of my experience. And I was putting these together, and I couldn't understand, why is it that I felt like there were 2 angels in my apartment, but I'm only seeing 1 star in the sky? Are the numbers significant? What's going on? And I remember one day I was in my apartment and thinking about the entire thing. And I was like, is there any story I can possibly think of that's even remotely close to this story of this star in the sky. And then it occurred to me, and I was like, oh, you've got to be kidding me. The story of the Magi in the Bible who saw the star that led them to where Jesus was born. So I go back and I read it. And what I found blew my mind. Most people have thought of this star that was in the sky as a actual star, or as some other supernatural thing that was like a fixed point in the sky that was like hovering over, right? Well, it's interesting because in the story, as told in the text, this would have been going on for a couple of years. This wasn't just one appearance, right? And so by the time the Magi would have arrived, it had been a significant period of time. The text says that the star moved ahead of them, okay, till it came over the place where Jesus lay. So it was long enough to anticipate the arrival of Jesus, for them to do their traveling, for them to figure out that they need to follow it, all this other stuff, right? This is the only story I can find that even remotely matches what's going on. Maybe I'm supposed to follow this, but I didn't want to just follow it. First of all, I didn't know exactly where it went, right? So I couldn't follow it. But in my mind, I was thinking, okay, if this happens again, then I should follow it. So I prayed and I said, all right, whatever you are, if you want me to follow this star in the sky, will you please do it again? So the following night, I'm out on my balcony and I'm looking. I see nothing. I mean, this was the first time I ever stepped out actually actively looking for this star thing in the sky, and I didn't find it. And I kid you not, at the exact split second when I decided to go back inside, I see it dart across the sky to the exact same location that it had gone before, or at least as best I can tell, exact same location. And I remember where it went because there was a crane in the distance, and it shot right in front of the tip of the crane. So I knew exactly, there was a fixed point on the horizon where I knew that it had passed over, so that way when it disappeared, I could actually take my Google Maps and point the compass there and start scrolling, which is what I did. I'm scrolling, and I come across this thing that most places in Stockholm are named in Swedish, right? There are English named places, but it just says New Life. And I click it and it's a church. And I was like, oh, you've got to be kidding me. But it was a Protestant church, which blew my mind because I was like, wait. How did I go from an Episcopalian to a Padre Pio who's Catholic to now a Protestant church in my story? This doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, well, all right, I'll see what's going on this Sunday. So I check it, and they do have a service that Sunday. So for the first time in forever, I went to a Protestant church. I had attended Catholic Mass a couple times that summer because after the Padre Pio experience, I went. But I show up at this Protestant church, and there's a traveling preacher. And this traveling preacher announces that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, he's doing a series on spiritual warfare. And I'm sitting there like, oh, this is way too timely. So I go on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and I listen to these. And the first time I show up on that Monday, I'm still thinking, how do I know I went to the right place? How could I possibly know that I followed this star-like thing in the sky to the right location? And then he puts up this slide. I nearly fell out of my chair. I didn't know what to think. I was like, I felt like all of heaven was like staring at me at that moment. And that in a strange way, and this is the part that's like been hard, was really hard for me to integrate. This had all been planned, right? Meaning from when I was 15, like you don't give somebody a dream when they're 15 unless you know all this other stuff that's going to happen, right? Where it's going to integrate back together, and then everything's going to tie together in this crazy synchronicity. Nearly that would have been like 16, 17 years later, something like that, after I had the dream that everything kind of tied together. Well, that is the gist of the story. I did have some of the people from the church come back to my apartment, and we said some prayers. We had communion in my apartment, and I then began the incredibly arduous process of trying to understand what had happened and trying to piece together the complexities of all of these elements. And one of the most difficult parts, to tie this all back into the beginning, the most difficult part of this whole thing was that this event happened the same week that the Navy announced that those videos were real. And I couldn't help but feel very strongly that heaven was essentially telling me, hey, look, this is important. what's happening. We know about it. And some of them are on the good side, if you want to put it that way. These aren't all bad, right? And also, this must mean that Jesus's birth was significant. And if Jesus's birth was significant, then his entire life was significant in some way. Which means that the miracles that are claimed to have happened, even the resurrection, are very believable now. If you have supernatural beings doing stuff like in my story, who says what they can or cannot do, right? Which means Jesus's entire existence on this earth was a pivotal moment in human history. So that concludes my story. It's an incredibly hard story to integrate into thinking, because the biggest question obviously comes up. It's like, well, how do all of these tie together? Because I don't have the identities of any of these beings. I don't have the identity of the being that was in the haunted house. I don't have the identities of the angels that were in my apartment. I don't have the identity of this star thing in the sky. I don't have the identity of the dark being that was obviously toying with me for so long. And to make it even more complex, I was basically had several Christian denominations involved in this thing. And so I was left, well, where do I go? I did end up going to that church. But after that whole experience, I really didn't feel like there was one particular church that was going to help me solve these answers. And normally when I would tell this story, people would say, well, that's incredible. And then they kind of act like it's so perplexing and awe-inspiring that there's very little that can be said. I'm a little bit overwhelmed by it, I think, at this point. It's been 3 years, and to be honest, the last several months I've been struggling with, in general, faith, because I don't know what to do now. It feels like whenever I go to churches, I just feel like there's something missing. Like I feel that my story and what's going on is not being heard. I don't get any growth out of hearing more Christian debates or doctrinal debates or constant discussions about which things are sins and which things aren't sins. It doesn't hit me the same way anymore, and it's become so difficult for me to work through these issues. And I think that's what I'm going to make this whole series about. This series is going to be about addressing the various issues that I see within not just the Christian communities, but also addressing the issues that I see within UAP and UFO related topics, discussing them best I can. I don't have any answers necessarily, although I can tell you this. If you have doubts about God's existence or about the existence of the supernatural, look, if you sincerely ask for some sort of insight on this and you really want to know, and if you set your heart to pursuing that which is good, I believe you will be given answers. Maybe not now, maybe like me, it'll be 10 years after you ask the question, but simply place yourself before God and before heaven and say, hey, I want to do what is best in this world, and can you please help me to understand? Because quite frankly, I don't think there's any way myself or anybody else is ever going to be able to comprehend this stuff without help from heaven itself. There's no way. None of this stuff is logical. There's so much, I guess you could say, mystery and symbolism going on that it's very hard for us to piece it together in a logical, rational way. So just want to say thank you for listening, and hopefully I can get some more videos up soon.